In 1955, the Federal Civil Defense Administration printed a cookbook, not a survival pamphlet, not a list of recommended foods, a cookbook with specific recipes, calorie-counted meal plans, and detailed cooking instructions built around one specific scenario: feeding your family for 14 days after a nuclear attack using only what was stored in your basement. The booklet was distributed to American households alongside civil defense preparedness guides and shelter instructions. It sat on kitchen shelves next to Betty Crocker and Joy of Cooking, and it answered, in the practical language of recipes and cooking times and serving sizes, a question that most Americans were afraid to ask out loud. If the world outside stopped functioning, what would dinner look like? The cookbook existed because the government had done the math and arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. A family that survived the immediate aftermath of a nuclear attack, that made it to shelter, that avoided lethal fallout exposure, that had stocked the recommended 14-day supply, would still face a problem that no amount of civil defense training had directly addressed. They would be hungry. They would be hungry for 14 days in a confined space, under conditions of extreme stress, with children who needed feeding on a schedule that could not be interrupted by a crisis. Military nutritionists working for the FCDA had calculated the caloric requirements for a family of 4 under shelter conditions. Elevated stress increased metabolic demand. Children required consistent protein intake to maintain immune function, and adults who were rationing food arbitrarily, eating less than their bodies required because they were afraid the supplies would run out, made worse decisions, became physically weaker, and were less capable of managing the psychological demands of a 2-week shelter period. The cookbook was not a luxury. It was a response to a specific, calculated nutritional and psychological requirement. The cooking constraints built into every recipe in the booklet were the most demanding part. No electricity, no gas, no running water. The FCDA's emergency kitchen operated on a single-burner camp stove fueled by canned heat or stored kerosene. A supply of stored water measured in the precise quarts the meal required, and whatever equipment could be stored in the shelter space. A single cast iron skillet, a medium pot, a bowl, a wooden spoon. Every recipe in the booklet was tested against these constraints before publication. If it required a second burner, it was rewritten. If it required fresh water beyond what the storage calculation allowed, it was reformulated. The government's test kitchen for the nuclear war cookbook was not a professional cooking facility. It was a simulated shelter space in a government building, and every recipe that made it into the final booklet had been successfully prepared in that space by a woman with no equipment beyond what the FCDA's recommended shelter kit contained. The booklet opened with a section on the nutritional philosophy behind the meal plan. Military nutritionists had established a minimum of 2,000 calories per person per day as the threshold for maintaining functional capacity under stress. The meal plan was built around that number with deliberate precision. Breakfast accounted for approximately 600 calories. The midday meal, the booklet consistently called it dinner in the older American usage, provided 800. The evening meal added 400. The remaining 200 calories were distributed as snacks: hard candy, a spoonful of honey, a handful of crackers. The snack allocation was not arbitrary. Child psychologists consulted by the FCDA had advised that children in a confined shelter environment required regular small food events throughout the day to maintain a sense of routine and normalcy that was itself considered protective against the psychological deterioration that could occur during a prolonged shelter period. The first recipe in the booklet was hardtack biscuits, 2 cups of stored wheat flour, ground from the wheat berries in the stockpile using the hand-cranked mill the FCDA recommended every family own, half a teaspoon of salt, enough stored water to form a stiff dough. The dough was rolled thin, cut into squares, pierced with a fork to prevent puffing, and baked on the cast iron skillet over low heat, covered until dry and firm throughout. The finished biscuit was dense, hard, and almost flavorless. The booklet acknowledged this directly and without apology. Hardtack was not designed to be enjoyable. It was designed to deliver calories in stable, portable form that would not spoil, could be stored for weeks without deterioration, and could be prepared by any adult with no prior baking experience using nothing but the materials already in the shelter. A batch made enough for 2 days of breakfast servings for a family of 4. The second recipe was bone broth soup. This required the ham bone that the FCDA's food stockpile list recommended every family include in their canned goods, a detail that most modern readers of the stockpile list overlook because a ham bone seems like an afterthought rather than a primary ingredient. The bone went into the pot with the full daily water allocation for cooking, a 1/4 cup of stored dried beans, and whatever shelf-stable vegetables the stockpile contained. The pot simmered for 3 hours over the lowest possible heat to conserve fuel. What came out was a thin, clear broth with dissolved protein from the bone marrow, soft beans for substance, and enough salt from the preserved ham to make it genuinely edible. The booklet's author wrote, with a practicality that reads as almost defiant, "This soup will not impress your guests. It will feed your family." The FCDA included this recipe in every edition of the booklet. It appeared again in the 1961 update. It appeared in the state-level civil defense cooking guides published in New York, California, and Illinois. It was, in the government's assessment, the single most important recipe in the collection. The third recipe was powdered milk oatmeal. Rolled oats cooked in reconstituted powdered milk instead of water, with a tablespoon of honey stirred in at serving. The recipe required no modification for children. The honey sweetened it enough to be acceptable to a 5-year-old who had been in a shelter for 4 days, and whose threshold for culinary complaints was already being severely tested. The nutritional profile was complete: carbohydrates from the oats, protein and calcium from the reconstituted milk, natural sugar from the honey, and enough caloric density to carry a child through a morning of confined activity. The booklet recommended this as the standard breakfast for the first 7 days of the shelter period on the grounds that routine itself had nutritional value, that a child who ate the same recognizable breakfast every morning experienced a form of stability that the confined environment otherwise made very difficult to provide. The fourth recipe was emergency chocolate cake. This entry requires a moment of explanation, because its presence in a nuclear survival cookbook is, at first reading, surprising. The FCDA included dessert recipes in the booklet not as an indulgence, but as a specific documented response to the morale dimension of the shelter period. Internal FCDA communications from 1954 and 1955 some of which are now declassified, show that agency planners were deeply concerned about the psychological deterioration that could occur in a family confined to a basement for 14 days under extreme uncertainty. The emergency chocolate cake, made from stored flour, cocoa powder, sugar, baking soda, a tablespoon of vinegar, vegetable oil and water, with no eggs, no butter, and no milk required, was explicitly described in planning documents as a morale asset. It cost almost nothing from the stockpile. It required 30 minutes to prepare and bake on the camp stove, and it produced, in a shelter environment, something that functioned as a signal to children that ordinary life had not entirely disappeared. The recipe worked because the acid-base reaction between the vinegar and baking soda aerated the batter in the absence of eggs, producing a cake that was genuinely moist and genuinely chocolatey and genuinely good in a way that surprised the nutritionist who first tested it in the simulated shelter kitchen. The fifth recipe was stored grain flatbread. Similar to hardtack but thinner and cooked faster, the flatbread used the same ground wheat flour with a small addition of baking powder from the shelter kit to give it slight leavening. Cooked in the skillet with a thin coat of stored shortening to prevent sticking, it was ready in 8 minutes and served as the vehicle for the honey, the canned meat, or the reconstituted powdered milk that constituted most of the meal components. The booklet noted that flatbread could be varied slightly in texture by adjusting the water ratio, stiffer for a cracker consistency, softer for something closer to a tortilla. This note on variation was not accidental. The FCDA's consultants had specifically recommended building small variations into the meal plan to reduce what they called menu fatigue, the psychological response to eating identical food repeatedly that could, over a 14-day period, cause family members to refuse to eat at all. The sixth recipe was canned meat hash, 1 can of corned beef or Spam, diced and combined with reconstituted dried potato flakes, another stockpile item that most people overlook, and cooked in the skillet until the potato crust formed on the bottom. The recipe took 20 minutes and produced something that resembled a genuine hot meal, with protein, carbohydrate, and enough fat from the canned meat to satisfy hunger for a full half day. The booklet included a note that the hash could be stretched for an additional serving by adding an extra half cup of potato flakes, reducing the per-person protein slightly, but extending the meal's reach if stockpile inventory required conservation. This kind of rationing calculation appeared throughout the booklet, not as a warning, but as practical instruction for a woman who was managing a 14-day food supply under conditions where resupply was not possible and waste was not acceptable. The cooking classes that accompanied the booklet's distribution were the part of the program that has been most completely forgotten. Through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, local civil defense offices in counties across the country ran emergency cooking demonstrations specifically built around the booklet's recipes. Women gathered in church halls and school kitchens and community centers to practice preparing the meals on camp stoves, to learn the techniques for grinding grain by hand, and to understand the rationing calculations that the booklet described in theory. The demonstrations were led by home economists who had been trained by the FCDA. They were attended by tens of thousands of American women who went home and, in some cases, practiced the recipes in their own kitchens against the possibility that practice would someday matter. The classes ended, as everything in the civil defense program ended, without announcement. The booklets remained on shelves. The camp stoves stayed in basements. And the women who had attended the demonstrations grew older and eventually could not be asked what they had learned. The Nuclear War Cookbook was quietly removed from civil defense distribution in the late 1960s as the program's philosophy shifted away from shelter in place and toward evacuation. The recipes did not disappear. They survived in the personal collections of women who had kept their copies, in the archives of state civil defense offices, and in the records of home economics departments at universities that had participated in the FCDA's training program. Some of the recipes resurfaced during the Depression-era nostalgia movements of the 1970s, stripped of their original context, attributed to the hard times of the 1930s rather than the hard planning of the 1950s. The emergency chocolate cake became known as wacky cake or crazy cake and circulated through recipe boxes across the country, losing its origins entirely. The hardtack biscuit became a Civil War reenactment staple. The bone broth soup became 60 years later a wellness trend sold in small, expensive cartons at health food stores. The government's Nuclear War Cookbook did not disappear. It scattered into the ordinary recipe culture of the country, unrecognized, still feeding people, still exactly as effective as it was designed to be.